Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, where we begin this time with a look at a unique weapon. Gatling Gun, the installation-type autocannon that Old Hunter Dura used in Old Town. This is a thing forcibly remodeled from one of those to be hand-holdable, and it is said that of Dura's 3 companions, the youngest used it. Possesses an extremely high rapid-fire capacity, but is incredibly heavy, and consumes mercury rounds rapidly. It can probably be said to be a difficult-to-handle weapon. As you can see, besides the reorganization of some information to work better in English, the translation of this item text is fairly straightforward. However, the Japanese name for this weapon marks a notable departure from a pattern we've seen in the past. That's because the Gatling part of the term Gatling gun comes from the name of a historical individual, Richard Jordan Gatling, a 19th century American inventor. As longtime viewers will probably recall, references to real-world terminology like this have so far been exclusively introduced in the process of translation, with the most notable example being the Molotov cocktail. Now that we have an example of the original Japanese text using such a term, though, the conversation around their use in English needs to change. Up until this point, it's been possible to argue that the original Japanese writer or writers made it a priority to avoid real-world references, while the translators did not. However, this item name shows us that this isn't the case. If there were any doubt about that, we need look no further than the description of Dura's mounted machine gun for evidence. The Japanese describes this weapon as a kind of autocannon, meaning there was a generic term the writers could have used for referring to this portable version. However, since they chose to use Gatling gun anyway, it seems like the avoidance of real-world terminology wasn't a priority for the Japanese side of things either. Of course, that's not to say the entire argument against using such words is now moot. For one thing, there's the anachronism of the phrase Molotov cocktail to contend with, since its origins come from a time after the historical period Bloodborne is set in. What's more, there's still a case that can be made that it would be better if both the original Japanese and the translation were to avoid these sorts of references. While there are still reasonable objections to be made about the use of this terminology, though, this item name makes it clear that it's not simply an issue of translation. It is in that sense that I think this item changes the conversation. While we're on the topic of real-world terminology introduced in translation, though, there's one quick correction I need to make about something I said in the previous episode. In it, I noted that by introducing the phrase 10 a penny into the descriptions of some pieces of the Old Hunter attire, the translators were adding the concept of pennies to Yharnam. Well, YouTube user MindsPatch astutely pointed out that we actually do have an example of metal coins that are used as currency in Yharnam. They even say what they are right in their item name: shining coins. True, we don't know what any of these coins were called, so the actual word penny is still technically a new term introduced by the translation, but based on everything we know about the distinctly British speech patterns of Yharnamites, it seems reasonable to assume that some of those shining coins would be pennies. Really though, what I see as the larger point here is the question of how much you care about word origin in your world building. Pennies might be a reasonably safe word choice, but does that mean Molotov cocktail is okay too? Honestly, whatever you might think about that, now that we've seen the original Japanese use terminology taken from the real world, this seems more like a matter of preference to me than ever. And having noted that, I think it's time we talked with one last church patient.
I have failed. Please, Lady Maria.
I don't think she can hear you, but I guess maybe it could help if I turn and open this giant door? While I do that, and then fight the boss on the other side though, there are some things about the first of those lines that I want to discuss. First, purely on the level of translation, I think it's worth noting that while my literal version may look different from the official one, the meanings are actually quite similar. The idea is there's some unspecified thing that patient was supposed to do, or that they believed they were supposed to do, and they found it impossible. In a more everyday scenario, I'd be inclined to translate this phrase as something more like, I couldn't do it. Rendered that way, it shouldn't be hard to see how small of a leap it is to go from there to, I have failed. The main difference I see is that the latter puts more emphasis on the personal sense of responsibility the speaker feels in having been unable to accomplish something. That shift is subtle, but it also makes sense, considering how the patient then proceeds to beg Lady Maria for what's probably some form of salvation, at least if the other dialogues we've encountered are any guide. But the thing that really intrigues me about this line is how well it ties in with the name of the boss I'm fighting now. To be clear, I intend to get into the specifics of that name, Living Failures, a little later, but at the moment, I just want to appreciate how unusual it is that this English language linking of the word failure works so well. You see, if this project were organized the way I'm used to seeing translation done as a freelancer, I would expect to receive a big file with all the Japanese dialogue for the patients at once, and possibly for several other characters as well. This would include lines for all the NPCs that we as players now know would end up being cut. Of course, as a translator, I'd have no way of telling which of these lines was likely to land on the chopping block, nor would there be anything to indicate where each NPC would be placed in the game. As a result, there wouldn't be any way for me to plan a link between one of these random dialogues and an upcoming boss name. So does that mean it's just a coincidence that the NPC who got these specific English lines is the one who goes up to plead with Lady Maria by the door that leads to the Living Failures? I suppose it's possible, but I think what we're really seeing is the benefit of the workflow FromSoft and Frog Nation worked out for Bloodborne's dialogue. Obviously, I don't know what that is, but we've seen a lot of clues throughout this playthrough that the dialogue is handled differently from the text. Recall, for instance, that there are no regional differences in the English language voice performances like we saw in a number of item descriptions, suggesting that the lines which were intended to be recorded went through a separate process. Also, as this clip from one of my earlier reference material videos shows, despite my playing the Japanese version of the game, the incidental enemy dialogue only seems to have been recorded in English. And if you're curious whether that's changed at all in the DLC, I can show you that it hasn't. Here's me talking to Simon to prove I have the Japanese voices on. Then after a little fast forwarding, we arrive at another short sound effect that you can plainly hear was recorded in English. This helps demonstrate that the English language voices have retained their priority throughout the development process. As I prepare to switch back to the Living Failures boss fight though, I also feel like I should note that if you want to see even more evidence of how integral the English voice acting is, you can go all the way back to my first reference material video to hear me speculating that the reason the Japanese voiced lines don't include all the information from the Japanese subtitles is that the scenes were likely timed to match the delivery of the English voice actors. So it seems likely to me that there's a system in place for better coordination between translators and developers when handling dialogue in this game. And if that's the case, this moment with the patient on the stairs is one relatively subtle example of the benefits such a system can provide. Having pointed that out though, I think it's time I moved on to the name of the boss I've now nearly defeated, and the interesting problem the translators would have been confronted with in the construction of its name. The tricky thing about it is capturing how the Japanese is sending two different signals. The base part of this boss name, the part that falls most neatly into the concept of a word, denotes a failed product, or some other type of unsuccessful creation. At the same time, though, the word has been given the pluralizing suffix tachi, which is used exclusively to indicate a group of people or animals. It's even more specific than the category of living things, because ordinarily you would not refer to, say, a group of trees as ki-tachi. So on the one hand, we have a boss being referred to as a collection of failed products, while on the other hand also being identified as a group of people. This obviously works out really well in the Japanese, because it perfectly encapsulates the way the Healing Church must have seen the patients who failed to become something. It's a view where technically they count as people, but ultimately are just failed experiments to be cast aside. Given that, the question then becomes how to make that same juxtaposition come across in English. Fortunately, we already know the official solution was the name Living Failures. Personally, I think this is a triumph, properly emphasizing that while these creatures live, they're regarded as unsuccessful rejects by the Church. It's also a good example of how a creative approach can be better at conveying information than a literal one, because among other problems, group of human failed products just does not communicate the core idea behind the Japanese as well as living failures. Sometimes, being too literal only gets in the way, as we can arguably also see with the name for the boss area we just unlocked, the Lumenwood Garden. In this case, everything hinges on the importance you place on a subtle distinction in terminology made by the Japanese. To begin with the more unified side of things though, you may recall that we've seen the word seirin before. This is a made-up piece of vocabulary composed of two kanji, one meaning celestial object or star, and the other being used as a counter for wheels or flowers. Literally, I've been translating this as starflower, and the term has appeared in both the location name for the area where we fight the celestial emissary and the description of the milkweed rune. However, each time it appears in Japanese, it's part of another word or phrase, and the second portion of that phrase is different every time. In the base game location, the kanji for grass is added to the end of seirin, strengthening the idea that these are meant to be flowers. Meanwhile, in describing what bearers of the milkweed rune become, that symbol for grass is dropped, and instead, the character for trunk, or main part, is added as part of a phrase. Finally, for the location unlocked by defeating the living failures, we see a return to a singular term, with the kanji for tree once again being added directly to the end of seirin. In English, though, while the location names are differentiated through the terms lumen flower and lumen wood, the milkweed description reuses lumenwood rather than conveying the literal idea of a trunk. Some might view this as an oversimplification, but personally I like the stronger connection the English makes between the milkweed rune and the plant it transforms players into. While this makes for an interesting example of the creative removal of a term, though, I'm also intrigued by the translator's additions, two of which are on display in this next item. Clocktower Key. Key to the clock tower at the very top of the Grand Cathedral. That room, which connects directly to the back of the giant astrological clock, is said to have at some point become the dwelling place of the woman the patients call Maria. As anyone who's played a lot of this DLC in English will probably notice, there's something missing from the Japanese version of the place name that shows up both in this item's description and also its name. Literally, it only describes a clock tower, Tokeito in the original, whereas the official English translation refers instead to the Astral Clocktower. That's not a change limited to this item either. Every time the clock tower is referred to in Japanese, whether it be part of an item description, dialogue, boss name, or location name, we can see the same shift in going from Japanese to English. That means the translators must have made a deliberate choice to add the word astral into the very concept of this location. This, as far as I'm concerned, is another huge win for the English version of the game, because in changing the ordinary word clock tower into the Bloodborne specific Astral Clocktower, the translators haven't just made it sound cool, they've better identified what the place really is. For evidence of this, we need look no further than this same item description, where we find the nearest equivalent to the term Astral Clocktower in Japanese. That would be the phrase Hoshimi Doke, which is a combination of two words into a singular concept. The second half of this game-specific term simply means clock, though the first half is a little more complicated. Hoshimi literally consists of two kanji that viewers may be getting familiar with by now, the first one meaning celestial object or star, and the second one meaning to see. So, in one sense, this term can be seen as the star-based equivalent of the concept of a moon viewing, although that's not the primary meaning of the term. Its regular definition is as a synonym for the term Hoshi Uranai, which can be used either as a colloquial way of referring to astrology, or specifically to horoscopes that you might find in a newspaper. So, to put all that together, this is a clock oriented towards the stars in order to draw astrological meaning from them. Also worth considering is that, as I said earlier, the Japanese conveys all this as part of a single idea, which is why in my literal version I went with astrological clock, and the official translation uses the phrase star-interpreting clock. But notice how both of these terms fail to capture the literal pun of the Japanese hoshimi, where this could be understood as a star-viewing clock. Well, this is where we start to see the brilliance of referring to the whole tower the clock is part of as the Astral Clocktower, because it's a name that accomplishes several things at once. First, it fills in this arguably missing bit of nuance from the word hoshimi, with its primary meaning of relating to or coming from the stars. The other thing it does, though, is draw on some of the associated meanings of the term in English. For example, in the world of Bloodborne, it's not hard to imagine a connection to the astral plane, a higher level of reality associated with the heavens that the soul is thought to traverse after death. After all, both the scholars of Bergenworth and the choir seem to believe that the sky and the cosmos are one, and we need to elevate our thoughts to higher planes. The mystical aspect of the term astral therefore fits in nicely with the theming of the game, even if the idea that the clock tower itself is otherworldly doesn't make literal sense. Finally, there's also the impression the term helps create that this building represents the figurative height of the healing church. This could fit in with the way the choir position themselves in the upper cathedral ward, and the fixation on upward movement that characterizes both Byrgenwerth and the healing church. Put all this together and you get the idea of a clock tower that's meant to stand above the rest of humanity, interpret the stars, and help make sense of the supernatural powers that seem to infuse the heavens. Whether you accept all of that or just part of it though, calling the location the Astral Clocktower works as a fitting description for the nature of the place in question. It's a great example of how a strong understanding of theme and genre, as well as the core idea behind an individual line, can help translators come up with names and terms that resonate with a given work. Also, I find it somewhat ironic that this key, which is of relatively little importance in terms of the lore of the game, contains the phrase that seems to have contributed so much to the presentation of an important location in the DLC. The thing is, this isn't just a one-way street, because the translators have made another addition to the text of this item description based on information from the rest of the game. Notice how in the official English, Maria is described as the caretaker of the tower's numerous patients. This is never actually stated in the Japanese. Literally, the text of the original simply says that the woman the patients call Maria started living behind the clock at some point. Once again, though, all the translators have done in introducing this term is describe the existing state of affairs as we probably already understand them in the game. We've heard all the patients crying out for help from Lady Maria. It seems obvious that she acts as their caretaker, so seeing her described as such fits what we know perfectly. As for why the translators would insert this information to begin with, opening the sentence this way helps them avoid some awkward phrasing. Literally, the subject of the Japanese sentence is, "that room which connects directly to the back of the giant astrological clock." It sounds clunky, and it also feels weird to describe how a room became a person's living space, as opposed to saying a person made a room their home. However, if the sentence were to open with Lady Maria as the subject, the information that the patients in the tower call her Maria would either become redundant or wind up sounding similarly awkward. Shifting the core statement to be about how the patient's caretaker made her home in the tower thus manages to neatly solve both problems. And while it does introduce a new term, it doesn't actually give players new information. Speaking of new information though, now that we've used the key to open the door to Lady Maria's home, let's see what we can learn from her directly.
A corpse should be left well alone. Oh, I know very well how the secrets beckon so sweetly. Only an honest death will kill you now. Liberate you from your wild curiosity.
Hey, leave me and my curiosity alone. Death won't stop me anyway. While I'm busy trying to make sure Maria stays dead though, I want to take an extensive look at her lines. They may be brief, but there's a lot in them that warrants discussion, especially in regards to how they tie in with the broader themes of both this DLC and the game as a whole. With that in mind then, let's begin by breaking down what seems to be the logic behind the Japanese text to see how it fits in with what's come before. Maria's first line is something of a combination observation and judgment. The wording here is fairly straightforward, with Maria noting that the player character is willing to scavenge her corpse, then remarking that this is not an admirable trait. As it's presented in the game, this comes off as a kind of test for our player character. Are we the kind of person to let a corpse be? Or are we willing to scavenge a dead body if it means discovering the secret Simon told us Maria was hiding? It's a test that, to paraphrase another set of Simon's lines, is meant to determine the strength of the inquisitive spirit of Byrgenwerth within us. As the second half of the first line indicates though, it's a test that we fail. Realizing that we can't bear to let the secret of the nightmare be, Maria then lets us know that she understands what drives us. She speaks of secrets as a sweet temptation, and even at this point in the game, I think it's fair to say players would know she's capable of recognizing their allure. After all, she's the caretaker of the patients hidden away in the research hall. She's seen what horrors can result from a single-minded search for answers when it comes to ascending beyond humanity. Anyway, perhaps because she understands just how strong the compulsion to seek after secrets can be, she has an extreme solution for overcoming it, which we learn in her last two lines. Her plan is to make us die so terribly that we're willing to abandon our drive to learn more. It's a line of reasoning I find intriguing, because it sounds to me like she's accounted for the fact that death won't be the end for our character. True, these lines could be taken to mean that a permanent death is the only cure for our curiosity, but the way I see it, the emphasis on our death needing to be horrifying, and the talk of us forgetting our drive to learn more makes it seem like she's accounting for our survival. By this understanding, rather than trying to put a stop to us by killing us, Maria plans to serve as such a formidable foe that we give up on progressing through the nightmare in hopes of learning its deepest, darkest secret. And this is where I want to start bringing the official English back in for comparison, because the sense I get from the final two lines there has me feeling basically the opposite way about Maria's thought process. Likely due to its invoking the concept of an honest death, the English version of this dialogue has me primarily thinking Maria wants to kill us once and for all, even if it's still possible to interpret her meaning in a way similar to how I did the Japanese. That makes this the part of the translation I feel most conflicted about, but at the same time, I don't think this is entirely the translator's fault. You may recall that back in Translationborne 78, I brought up how there's a whole set of interactions between the player character, Simon, and Maria that got cut from the game. Well, considered in the context of that scenario, there's more to be said in favor of the phrase an honest death than there is in the current version of the DLC. The way it seems like things would have played out is this. The player character would reach Lady Maria with her still alive. She would make it sound like what we saw in the research hall was the extent of what the church had to hide in the nightmare, and encourage us to return to the hunt. The player character could then talk to Simon and learn that Maria is actually hiding the biggest secret of all. At that point, players could choose to either kill Maria themselves and loot her corpse, or refuse to kill her. In the second case, Simon would be responsible for her apparent death, and the player would then be able to loot her corpse to progress. What this means is that when these lines were recorded, they were intended to be directed at someone either directly responsible for Maria's death, or a scavenger happy to profit from Simon's doing the dirty work. In light of that, the phrase an honest death makes a strong contrast to the dishonesty of the player character's actions. It's not a scenario where Maria first tests and then resolves to dissuade the intellectual curiosity of someone who just happens to have reached the room behind the clock tower, it's a pointed confrontation. Under those circumstances, I think the official English version of these two lines makes even more sense than it does in its current implementation. Of course, as I also mentioned before, voice actors are expensive and can be difficult to schedule, meaning it's likely that once the English lines were recorded, they could be cut but not otherwise altered. Meanwhile, the Japanese subtitles could be changed if necessary to adapt to the new context, so it's no surprise that they arguably work better in the current in-game context. Frankly, I think it's impressive how well this dialogue ends up working despite the removal of so much of the surrounding context, particularly the very first line. That's primarily because it preserves what I see as the most crucial aspect of the line, which is the way Maria judges the player character for their actions. Admittedly, the staging of the scene and the delivery of the line help out here, but I feel like even in text, it would be clear that when Maria says, "A corpse should be left well alone," she means it as an indictment of what the player character was about to do. True, the wry observation of the original is gone, but as the first thing this character says to a stranger, I find this to be a stronger statement. Besides, there's an additional thematic weight to Maria making this statement that I would argue comes across more strongly than in the Japanese. Remember, the whole foundation of the Healing Church involves digging up the Tomb of the Gods below Yharnam. Several of the rituals involved in exploring these catacombs explicitly require gaining access to body parts, including remains both human and inhuman. So when Maria talks about leaving corpses be, she's making a statement that doesn't just repudiate the player character, but the methodology of the Healing Church itself. Of course, it's questionable how broadly Maria is actually speaking in this situation, but as we'll see, she's a character that has her fair share of regrets, so I think that's worth keeping in mind. As for how well this works with the Japanese, I do think it's possible to arrive at a similar conclusion, since Maria evidently holds the player character in low esteem for searching her presumed corpse. However, that same ironic tone that I noted earlier was lacking from the English makes the statement come across as more directed at the player character, so it's not as easy to make wider connections from this one bit of dialogue. But not every line of this translation involves a major departure from the wording of the Japanese. There's still the second line to consider, and this one is both the most similar across the two languages and the part of the text least impacted by the change in context. However, I still think it's worth dwelling on how much more natural the official English sounds than a more literal rendering. When Maria says, "Oh, I know very well," we understand that not only is she claiming to grasp our motivation, but that she probably has some personal acquaintance with the truth-seeking impulse that drives us. That impression is then reinforced when she speaks of how the secrets beckon so sweetly, which I think is a nice bit of subtle storytelling. Furthermore, I don't know about you, but this particular phrasing puts me in mind of the wording of the Healing Church's warning about foul beasts dangling nectar, in a way that the literal statement that secrets are sweet does not. The parallel here is based off of the shared idea of the importance of resisting temptation, though of course the Church's mantra seems to be more about the allure of beasthood than the urge to uncover secrets. Whether you feel similarly about that additional association or not, though, I think it's clear that the translators found a great way to deliver exactly what they needed to in the second line. Honestly, I feel like the translation of all 4 of these lines still works extremely well, despite their recontextualization. After all, even if the wording on the second to last line were tweaked to something like, "Only a horrifying death will cure you now," to hopefully better convey the sense that Maria could be aware of the player's ability to return from death, that's only a minor change in the grand scheme of things. When you take a step back and consider how this short set of lines functions on the whole, how they further the theme of the drive to reveal the nightmare's secrets, and how they tie in with the history of Byrgenwerth and the Healing Church, I'd say they work exceptionally well. So that covers all the main points I wanted to make about the dialogue leading into this boss fight, but there are a few things I haven't acknowledged so far that I feel are worth addressing before I end the episode. First of all, the boss name. This is something I feel like I've basically covered already. The addition of Astral to the literal term clock tower I mentioned before. Maria is literally Maria, with the potential connection to the Latin name for the Virgin Mary left a possibility in both languages. That just leaves the extra title of Lady to discuss, but this is a change that fits both prior references to the character and her role in the game. Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower sounds noticeably more epic than Maria of the Clock Tower, and in boss names, that counts for something. Certainly that seems to be true of this boss, who I'm sure we can all agree has proved worthy of an impressive sounding title. As I revel in my victory then, the only other aspect of the translation that leaves for me to bring up is the double meaning of the term asaru that Maria uses when she chides the player character for searching her corpse. Literally, it can also mean to fish, and the idea of corpse fishing ties in with the location we'll be headed to in the next episode. Personally, I wouldn't make that play on words a high priority when translating the line, but it is worth acknowledging. Those are just my thoughts, though. If you'd like to share any of yours, I would love to hear from you. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.